Thank you all for being here. I appreciate it. I'm gonna show some slides, and they're probably gonna be hard to see. So maybe if afterwards you want to come up and take a look at them. I like to illustrate the place where I live and that I write about. I think it's important. I grew up in Orangeburg, South Carolina. I've spent a lot of time in Western North Carolina, and now I live in a small town in Central Ohio. And the town that I write about in this book is called Newark, Ohio. It's about 45 minutes, maybe faster if you're driving quickly, from Columbus, Ohio. It's a Rust Belt community that is right now in for some big changes. If you've heard of the CHIPS Act, that was passed largely because of the county that I live in. We are on the cusp of building two enormous Intel fabs in Licking County, so not too far from where a lot of this took place. I'm a journalist. I'm a professor too, but I'm a journalist when I'm having the most fun. I write about the overdose crisis. I write about harm reduction mostly. I cover mostly Central Ohio, but I also cover the rest of the state and West Virginia. And this book is the culmination of about 4 years of reporting on the community and on the overdose crisis. And the reason I started writing about this was because so many people were dying. Last year, 107,000 people died in the United States plus. In Ohio, 5,200. In the county where I live, 47. And we're looking to actually probably surpass that this year. All indications are that we are going to. I would like to at some point maybe I will try to explain a little bit about why all this is happening, why it's happening the way it's happening now. But I can tell you it's not getting better, and there's some very specific reasons for that. But I do think there's some reason for hope, and that's one of the reasons why I wrote this book. I felt like media coverage of the state where I lived and of the community that I lived in tended to focus on the bodies, and I think in very grim ways. There was a story about the coroner in Akron, Ohio. Couldn't find enough room to store bodies because of the large surge in carfentanil and fentanyl-related overdoses in 2016. And the story was, in the national media. And if that's all you see, you don't really see what's actually happening on the ground. And so I wanted to tell a different kind of story. And this book is called This is Ohio. It's a response to another book called Ohio. And I will not name the author of that book, but I think this is the Ohio that I see and that I'm proud to call home. One of the solutions in Licking County has been to create a safe space for people who use drugs. And this woman right here, Trish Perry, started handing out coats to people who were unhoused in February of 2016, I believe. And it kind of blew up. It became more than just handing out coats. It became handing out meals, and they set up shop on the corner of Buena Vista and Main in Newark, which is on the sort of the east side of Newark, and is a traditionally underserved community. As anyone who spends any time at this place, I call it the corner. People that go there call it the homeless outreach or the corner. They'll tell you that the overdose crisis especially affects people who are caught up in our criminal justice system, and that's who she was really trying to serve. Her son is someone with substance use disorder, and so she really saw the faces of the people who were coming to the corner to get coats, to get meals, as in some ways her son, right? She started handing out naloxone, and she also started handing out syringes, and that is sort of the center of the story in some ways. The people who serve these folks know that thinking about addiction and about overdose as a social justice problem, that we need to shift our thinking and start to think of it as a social justice problem or as a human rights crisis that mostly affects poor people. I mean, all the research is very clear on this. I think much has been made about the fact that opioids have entered suburbia and that it has for a long time been a largely white suburban and even rural problem. And that has changed dramatically in the last 5 years. The fastest growing group who are overdosing in Ohio right now are black men ages 62. That's the median age, okay? So if you are poor, if you are unhoused, if you are not straight, cisgendered male, you are more likely and you are at greater risk of overdose, right? And so, yeah.
You said the median age was 62?
62, yeah.
Surprising.
Right, we'll get to that. Why is that? That's a great question, yeah. It's a great question. This is Ohio, so this is Ohio. This book itself tells the story of a grassroots movement, all right? A grassroots movement in a small town or city, 50,000 people, in a rural county in Ohio, folks trying to change the lives of the people around them, right? And they're not waiting for the people in power to make that change, right? And I always say this is a story about ordinary people doing extraordinary things because it's true. This is the courthouse, and some of the action in this book takes place in the courthouse, but I'm not going to go into that. I kind of want to focus just on Trish and Billy. And Trish is the woman who runs the corner, and Billy is her son. I was seeing people fight hard, fighting really hard for the people in their community. And I actually, like, when I asked a friend of mine to take this shot, because this was just a plan for a cover, I wanted it to look like these sort of fierce people from like a superhero movie or something like that. And that's kind of how I think of them in some ways. They are the heroes of this book. These are all people who are volunteering to help people who are in house, but also to bring harm reduction to Licking County. Harm reduction, before I read, I'm going to read a little bit, but before I do that, harm reduction, what is harm reduction? So harm reduction is a public health approach to addressing the harms of substance use, right? That's one way of thinking of it. The other way of thinking of it is that harm reduction is actually a social justice movement to address the harms not only of substance use, but of the drug war, right? And I think that's, to me, that became painfully apparent as I reported this book and as I continue to report on it. The overdose crisis is not going to end until the drug war ends. That's pretty clear to me at this point. So Newark, Ohio, where this book takes place, was once home to people who crafted amazing earthworks and mounds. Actually, we're about to hopefully become a UNESCO World Heritage Site because of the earthworks in our county. And then later on, it became a place where people built. It was a crossroads for industry, for canals and railroads, a big hub for railroads in Licking County for many, many years. And I think this is part of the story. The story of Newark is the same as in many places. As the world became more connected and local companies were gobbled up by bigger ones, having agriculture and being close to Columbus has always given Newark a base, has always helped support this place. But now farmland is slowly disappearing, and Licking County is kind of moving closer to Columbus. In 10 years, Newark could be part of a central Ohio megalopolis. But I suspect it will retain its scrappy, no-nonsense identity, rooted firmly in its manufacturing past. Blocks from the county courthouse is the Works, an interactive museum focused primarily on the history of industry in Licking County. On the second floor, in addition to the giant bones of a mastodon, you'll find cases full of things that people in this community once made: stoves, glass bowls and plates, and so on. The display is at once a paean and a dirge. There's a photo in one of the employees of Whirl Stove Company from around 1892. Maybe 80 men stand in front of a brick building with 2 large windows. Some are propped up on the sills. They are dressed in filthy work clothes, light cotton shirts and pants, covered in sweat and dirt. Some wear no shirts at all, only suspenders. Lots of mustaches, folded arms, serious faces. One man looks off to his right. The man next to him with massive biceps looks directly into the camera. Here and there, if you look closely, you can see a few children. And down in the front row, just off center, a man with his head cocked to the left, with a slight grin. This is not a past that I want to romanticize. Their work was hard, hot, and dangerous. These men made things. They built stoves that people cooked on and fed their families with. And during World War II, Whirl completely switched over to making artillery shells. These were not objects that you conjured into being, but objects that you crafted into existence. And that's that guy. I like that guy. That world, of course, has changed a lot, but Newark, as a small Midwestern city, is pretty typical. If you're familiar with some of those cities, I'm thinking of places like Anderson, Indiana, which also has glass manufacturing in its past, Lima, Ohio, just in the neighborhood, Zanesville, Lancaster. These are places that were one time hubs of industry, no longer are, and you can kind of see, where the industry existed at one time, and you can see what's left of it. And part of the problem in a place like Newark is housing. Housing is a big issue everywhere, but it's a big issue in Newark. There's a lot of substandard housing, the remnants of that industrial past. It's actually a city that I think is doing pretty well, but still, even in Newark, 56% of the community is just getting by, according to United Way's ALICE numbers, right? So it's no surprise then that the overdose crisis seems to have especially affected places like Newark, places that have been deindustrialized, and affecting people on the margins in those places. In some ways, to understand what's happening in Newark, though, I think you have to understand what happened in places like Huntington, West Virginia, or Portsmouth, Ohio. I've done a lot of reporting from Portsmouth. Let's see. Portsmouth is on the river. It's very southern Ohio. It's right on the river across from Kentucky. It's a beautiful, beautiful place. But it's really the buckle of the opioid belt, for sure. In Portsmouth, the model for the pill mill, if you've ever heard this term, so pill mills were basically places where you could go in. There was a doctor there who would, ask you if you had any pain. You could say yes. You would get a script for hundreds of Percocets, oxycodone, etc. Right? And those places existed for years, especially down in Portsmouth. And in some ways, it gave people, it caused some people to become addicted to oxy and to Percocet and to opioids in general. In 2011, the state decided, after much grassroots organizing in Portsmouth and other places, to get the state to shut down these pill mills, and the state did in 2011. Great. Not so great, right? Because what happened next, as my friend Abby Spears, who runs the syringe exchange in Portsmouth, says, she at the time, and this is really interesting, she was working for the police department, taking calls to the police department. She said it felt like it was overnight, really weeks after those pill mills were shut down, that they began to have lots of issues with heroin. Heroin had always been around, but it very quickly became the drug of choice because that was kind of all people were left with. Okay, so I want to point this out. So you've got a place where you can get a safe supply of a drug, right? That 70% of Americans have taken at some point or another. Roughly 3 to 5% of those people have become addicted, depending on the studies you look at, okay, or less, or addicted or have had issues with dependency, okay, right? So you have a safe supply. You get rid of the safe supply, and people begin to go to the streets to get illicit opioids, right? Oh, almost overnight. Yes, sir.
The appearance is that more people were dying from OxyContin than the 3 to 5% that you mentioned.
I'm talking about addiction, not overdose. I think these are two separate conversations. And that's one thing I always like to make clear. The title of my book is The Overdose Crisis, not the opioid epidemic or the opioid crisis. I think those are kind of separate conversations. They're intertwined. The thing that I'm most concerned about as a journalist and as a human being is that so many people are dying of overdose, right? And not everyone who uses opioids has substance use disorder or is addicted, right? I think we conflate these two things. Popular culture does a really good job of that. Addiction doesn't always happen like it happens on TV too, right? So the thing that I'm really focused on is overdose. There were not as many overdoses in Portsmouth when they had Oxy on the streets. There just weren't. There were a lot more overdoses since then. And now Portsmouth in Scioto County is sort of, in Ohio at least, is one of the, in terms of per capita, it has the highest overdose rate, second or first. Yeah. Y'all can ask questions, I don't mind. Normally I like just do a talk, but we got a good sized crowd, so I can just, so if you do have questions, please ask for me to clarify. So that's where we are, right? So we get to this place where, there is no safe supply, right? And it's all heroin, and people who had been taking Percocets or Oxys recreationally or because they had substance use disorder begin to try out heroin in lots of different forms, okay? There's one book that will say that it was all black tar, but that's not true. It was a lot of different things. There was a lot of stuff on the streets. By about 2014, 2015, we began to see fentanyl, right? And then maybe you heard about fentanyl begins to enter the supply. It hits the supply in a big way in 2016, 2017 in Ohio when we get carfentanil, which people talk about as a elephant tranquilizer, okay? But it's a really powerful opioid. And someone in Akron, I think, and someone in Springfield, and someone in Cincinnati got shipments of carfentanil, and it hit the streets in Ohio, and lots of people died very quickly, right? So then that was when people were like, oh no, the drug supply is different. It's not all heroin. If anyone tells you that there's heroin on the streets of the United States right now, they are lying. There is no heroin, okay? So we've got to the place where we had this thing, right? We had these drugs that were manufactured, and now we have mostly fentanyl, okay? Enter Trish Perry, right? Trish Perry, right around 2015, when I started reporting on this, kind of came across my radar as a really interesting human being who was trying to get the county, Licking County where I live, to change its public health policies. And she had a tendency to tick a lot of people off, so I knew she'd be a great character. Women like Trish Perry are part of a new wave. Call them activists, organizers, citizens. Call them warriors. They are on the ground, on the phone, on social media. They are fighting this overdose crisis. They counsel people who use drugs, helping them get into treatment, and they advocate for them. They sit in hospital ERs with people awaiting withdrawal management. They distribute naloxone to anyone who'll take it. They are, and this is important, mostly mothers. I've met many fathers who care for and advocate for their sons and daughters with substance use disorder, but mothers seem to make up the majority of those people on the front lines, the ones starting organizations, lobbying legislators, counseling others. In Licking County, Trish especially has gained a reputation, for better or worse, as a mother not to be messed with, a mother who will go to the mat for her child. Sometimes she can piss people off, online and in person. She is honest to a fault, fueled by righteous anger at some times and sweet, non-judgmental love at others. Trish and I are still very close, and she texts me about something that's happening, and she is enraged, and she wants to know what I'm going to do about it all the time. Just yesterday, actually. Yeah. She tells me of a time in the local ER with Billy, her son. His veins were so blown out that the nurse was flummoxed. And I remember feeling ashamed, she says, and she starts crying. Trish has learned, though, not to be ashamed. On the top of her right arm is a semicolon tattoo, a Christmas gift from Billy, with "Blessed Never Give Up," over a background of pastels, green, red, and purple, with seagulls flying above. The semicolon is there to separate one story from the next story yet to be written, one tragedy from one triumph, one collapse from one recovery. She shows it off with pride because getting people's attention about addiction and overdose is her life's work. In addition to working 40 hours a week at a pet store, she's taking classes to earn her bachelor's degree, helping to raise her grandson, and caring for her father, who has cancer. She wakes up every morning at 4 o'clock to check her email, to schedule posts for a Facebook support group she runs, to write cards to prisoners and folks in treatment, and to read up on addiction and pending legislation. In the past year, she's hosted 3 naloxone trainings, spoken to 2 Ohio House committees, and organized an overdose awareness rally in Newark. Every day, she says, she's in the fight. Does everybody know what naloxone is? Everyone? Naloxone is the opioid overdose reversal drug, and some people call it Narcan. That's the generic is naloxone. It's very easy to use, and if you don't have any, it's not bad to have in your car. So she introduces me to her son, Billy, and I began talking to Billy quite a bit. One of the things that I learned from Billy and from Trish was the ways in which stigma sort of shaped their experiences in our county. That people shunned Billy because he has substance use disorder. And people who also needed help were really afraid to go for help. And Trish has kind of become this mentor for a lot of families and friends and partners who are dealing with substance use disorder and their significant others, right? Because she is a bulldog and she will not take no for an answer, and she refuses to allow people to be treated like less than human. Right? And I think that's one of the things about her that is that I feel like I was able to tackle some of my own biases, right? By watching how she negotiates the world. One of the things that she was trying to do with her son Billy was to begin advocating for a syringe exchange in Licking County. The way the law works in Ohio is that syringe exchange is legal, but the county has to decide whether or not they're going to allow it, right? We really firmly believe in home rule in Ohio. So the county board of health has to vote on whether or not we're going to have a syringe exchange. There's only one doctor on our county board of health. That gives you an idea of the battle that they were having to wage, right? Her son Billy, and that's him right there, is really smart, super smart, articulate, and can speak in front of groups, right? And so he begins the process of becoming an activist. While I was reporting, he speaks in front of city council, and he talks about his substance use disorder and like the struggles he'd had. At the time, he was experiencing sobriety. He had been for about 6 or 7 months when he started this. But he's speaking in front of city council. He's speaking to the health board. He really wants to reframe addiction and overdose as health issues in Licking County and in Ohio, and try to transform the sort of war on drug narrative that people believed in. And so he begins talking a lot about harm reduction. And hearing about harm reduction from Trish is one thing, but from Billy, it was another, I think, for a lot of folks. He doesn't quite have the edge that his mom does. But what he was trying to say and the story that he was trying to tell folks was about how, when he is struggling, it's hard to find safe spaces to be, right? And harm reduction is about meeting people where they're at, right? Meeting people in the place of their struggle and saying, okay, how can I help you, right? Which doesn't happen very often to people who use drugs. It's about keeping people safe and alive, for sure, but it's also about making a human connection. And I think that conversation is often lost when we talk about syringe exchange or syringe service programs or needle exchange or whatever you want to call it. I'm going to call it syringe exchange right now because that's a lot easier to say than syringe service program. But when people talk about syringe exchange, very often the conversation is around needles and needles being on the ground and all this kind of stuff. And we lose sight of what's really important here is that people who use drugs are getting health care, right? And they're getting health care in a way that they hadn't before. In many ways, what's happening right now in Ohio and the rest of the country, I think in many ways we're addressing this particular drug crisis in ways that are different from the ways that we were addressing the crack epidemic in this country in the 80s and 90s. But the drug war still persists. And through Billy, I learned a lot about how that is sort of happening here. In 2017, the latest year for which the official numbers are available when I read this book, there were roughly 2.3 million people incarcerated in the United States. That's dipped down, I think, at this moment to about 2.1. Almost half of those people who are incarcerated, and when I say incarcerated, I mean also a part of the carceral state, meaning they, you are on probation or parole, you're somehow connected to the system. Half of those people are there because of some drug-related offense, right? And that number doesn't include those who committed crimes to support drug use or to support their drug use because using illicit substances is illegal. And if you're using them, you can't necessarily get a job, so then you do other things, and those things get you into trouble, right? So we're talking about this huge system that's really deeply connected to the drug war, right? Police, prosecutors, and judges spend a lot of time punishing people for drug possession, even though a lot of them will say we can't prosecute our way out of this problem. I hear that a lot. These kinds of arrests disrupt low-income communities and communities of color especially, making lives more complicated, causing people to miss work, causing families to lose mothers, fathers, siblings. Felony convictions create even more complications. Surprisingly, or maybe not, at the time I'm writing this, there's this issue. It's called Issue 1. It's going to be on the ballot, and actually, it's going to be on the ballot and it's going to, sort of not decriminalize possession, but make some of the charges a lot lower, right? And make some of the charges that were felony charges misdemeanor charges. So it would resolve a lot of issues for many people. But law enforcement is in favor of this. Prosecutors are in favor of. Law enforcement and prosecutors are deeply opposed to this bill, right? The Lincoln County Sheriff, Randy Thorpe, told the Newark Advocate, which is a local newspaper, that the measure was decriminalization, plain and simple. He argued, law enforcement requires the weight of proportional criminal consequences, not just to curb abuse and trafficking, but also to rebuild and save lives. In other words, sometimes it takes a stick to help someone get sober. Early one morning, I picked Billy up at his house and I drive him down to Waverly, which is about an hour and a half, 2 hours south of Newark. And he's there. He has to go to court. He has to go to court because he's dealing with a charge that he got. It's called abuse of harmful intoxicants. And it was a charge that he got while he was in treatment. He overdosed while he was at a treatment facility. And he ended up in the hospital. And in the hospital, sheriff's deputies came, they charged him. And for over 2 years, he was dealing with this charge. He'd have to drive down to Waverly, go to court, and every single time he would go down there, they would move the court date. He'd have to drive back home, whatever. I took him down one time, and it was the 5th time that he'd gone down there. And we go, we're sitting around in a waiting room, and I'm looking around, and the place looks like a Walmart. And I said, it looks like a Walmart. This woman goes, no, this used to be a Kmart. And Billy goes, well, they've still got the blue light special. And so here we were, sitting there for about 5 hours with Billy, waiting for him to go to court, right? And he ends up getting the date moved again, right? At that point, this was the 5th time he had gone down there. At that point, he had still never met with the public defender that was helping him out in this case. At that time, he was running a painting business. He had like 5 employees, and he was like just gangbusters. Things were going great for him. But he had to disrupt his life to go down there and do that. And it's those little things, right? It's those little things that contribute to making people who are on the path to success, to making their lives pretty miserable, right? And he's really frustrated. By the end of it, he's getting really kind of pissed off as we're waiting there, and he's just like, "Why? How am I supposed to do this? How is anyone supposed to do this? How are we supposed to get out of this cycle, right? If this is the way we're treating people who use drugs." Back in Licking County, Billy and his mom and a coalition of folks began to put some pressure on the county to get this syringe exchange passed. The Board of Health votes, and they vote against having a syringe exchange. They didn't want to have one, 8-0. They did it actually in an executive session, and they didn't tell anyone that it was going to be on the agenda. And then they got sued and had to do the vote again, but they still voted against it. So Billy makes an appearance at a protest at the health department, and he's speaking to the news anchor. And what I like about this moment is that he's just really clear-headed in his approach to what was happening. A reporter from Spectrum One News asked Billy if he'll go on camera. Billy tells him how he had attended Board of Health meetings for months, asking for support for a syringe exchange, and how the board had voted in executive session without public discussion or without listing it on their agenda, how they have yet to explain their decision, and how he is here today to seek answers and hopefully change some minds. If they'd paid attention to the research and science in all the counties that have done this, Billy says, it's a no-brainer. It's easier for them to say no comment than to say, we've made a decision based on scientific fact, and we've decided to go against it. Billy is fired up, and the reporter asks him why. I'm a 10-year IV drug user, Billy answers. I've been in recovery for over a year now. During the 10 years of using, I contracted hepatitis C. I've had abscesses that almost took my life. I've been hospitalized for endocarditis. A small thing like a 12-cent syringe could have prevented a lot of that. What we've been doing for so long with the war on drugs is not working. In fact, it's cultivating addiction. We got to start looking at other pieces to the puzzle. There's no one fix to the opioid crisis in America. Billy's on message, on point, and he seems more comfortable with this camera in his face than he did standing in front of city council. Then the reporter asks him what advice he would give to people like him who are no longer using drugs and trying to be abstinent. As cliche as it sounds, take it one day at a time. Once we stop using drugs doesn't mean our life turns into rainbows and unicorns. Life is difficult at best, but taking life one day at a time, one obstacle at a time, what I've been able to accomplish in the last year has blown me away. I think it's important to understand that syringe exchange for a person like Billy and for people who use drugs in general is a point of contact, and it's healthcare. Now more than ever, syringe exchange is important for building connections with people who use drugs because we need to make sure that naloxone is getting into their hands. As I was reporting this, I went to Vancouver in Canada, right? And there, I got to see what serious harm reduction looks like. And it was eye-opening to me. One of the things that kept happening while I was there was that I would tell them where I was from, and people would say that they were genuinely sorry. One woman gave me a hug. She's like, I am so sorry. When you look at the numbers per capita, Ohio versus Canada, Ohio is way ahead, right? Canada has serious harm reduction. Some of the things that they do there, they do heroin-assisted treatment or opioid-assisted treatment. So they actually use heroin, and they give people heroin twice a day. They inject it, and that way they are not out in the streets getting whatever's out there. and they are staying safe, and they are staying in contact with health professionals. They are trying out using fentanyl instead of heroin now for some people. But the heroin that they get is diacetylmorphine, and it's actually from a lab in Switzerland, right? They do that. They use something called an overdose prevention site, a place where people can go and use drugs safely with others who are around them. I've since been to overdose prevention sites in New York City and in Denmark. I went to an overdose prevention site this summer in a town the size of Newark, Ohio, in Denmark. And it's a place where people could go and use drugs safely. No one has ever died there. People are not overdosing in Denmark the way that they are in Ohio. I think one of the reasons that things are different in Vancouver and in Canada is because they've allowed people who use drugs to participate in the conversation about how we address substance use disorder. They've allowed people who use drugs to be a part of the conversation about how we address overdose. And they've said, these are things that we need. These are things that would keep us safe. These are things that would keep us alive. That's beginning to happen in the United States in some places, but not fast enough. I think the emphasis is still on abstinence, and it precludes people from speaking. People who are using drugs are scared to speak in public because of the drug war, right? So we have this cycle here. But I think there's a lot of hope, and I think the hope is in these nascent grassroots organizers. I would say that what is happening and what I describe happening in Newark, Ohio, is happening in cities and towns all over this country right now. And it's pretty impressive. And when those organizers are able to shift from just doing mutual aid work, which is really the core of what they do, towards helping make policy decisions, then things will change. I think the last thing I would say is I asked my friend Noah at one point to sum up my book in a meme, and he did. And it says, the social contract will save, and he says, the social contract is broken, renegotiate. And I actually think that's true. I think that until we get to the place where we, as a culture, allow someone like Billy to speak in the public sphere and begin to see what's happening as a public health crisis, generally see that as rather than a criminal one, then we're going to keep seeing a lot of bodies, But I think this is a story of hope. The people in this book give me a lot of hope, and there they are. And this says the axe doesn't have the last word; we have the last word. And I think, to me, that sort of defines their grittiness, their scrappiness, and their hopefulness, despite it all.